Wow, the twisted tale of Willy Seabrook and his flesh-eating zombies. A lecture by Einida, Excs and Viktor Criterion. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about Willy Seabrook, a man who was many things: a sensational yellow journalist, an explorer, a writer, an occultist, and a cannibal. He was a popular writer in the 1920s and 30s. He wrote 11 books about his various adventures, and he would be forgotten if it weren't for his time in Haiti, where he stumbled across the concept of zombies. He is credited as the first Western writer to describe Haitian zombies. Well, the zombie concept took off and changed the course of entertainment forever. Oh, and he was the first writer to write about his time in an asylum to cure his alcoholism. His book, Asylum, was published the same year that Alcoholics Anonymous was created. The founder of AA, Bill Wilson, was known to have read Willy's book, and the earliest versions of the AA Bible mentioned Willy by name. Willy's life was a journey of success and tragedy. He came from a family of men who threw their careers away to pursue their passions. Willy's grandfather, who was a friend of Abraham Lincoln, threw his career away to tend to his fey young wife, who was very, very strange. Her name was Piney, and she had mystical visions. When Willy was a young boy, he was sent to live with his parents for a time, and he became very close to his grandmother Piney. She had a bit of an opium addiction, and she used to take Willy into the woods where she hid her stash. Willy writes that she introduced him to altered states of consciousness during these visits to the woods, where he would have fantastical visions. But he swears she never gave him opium, just that she was able to create a new reality because of her strange abilities. This exposure to altered states at such a young age was going to mark his journey through life. It created the first of what Willy would call his supreme wants, a tremendous desire in Willy to explore the various ways to get into altered states. Willy's grandfather had thrown away a powerful job as the collector of the port at Baltimore, and now he was the owner of a small county newspaper in Westminster, Maryland. Willy used to hang out in the office and marvel at this man who would write things down on a paper with a feather quill pen and then hand the paper to a team of typesetters who would convert his writings into a newspaper. Willy was particularly taken with the grand steam-powered printing press that majestically turned his grandfather's words into the words that were to be read by the entire county. This, Willy recalled, was the genesis of his second supreme want, and that was to become a writer. Willy's father was being prepared to become a congressman when he heard the calling of God and threw away his political career to become a pastor. This decision meant that the family moved to Kansas during Willy's childhood. His father bought a stereopticon machine and spent a lot of money on slides to show the Native Americans scenes from the Bible. Being the child of a pastor, Willy was bored by his father's sermons, but when his grandfather would read the vivid tales of the Old Testament, it created a desire for Willy to find a living religion that practiced altered states. In 1917, Willy got his start as a writer when he was an ambulance driver in World War I. His diary was adapted to a short book about his experience, which included being gassed in Verdun. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre for his injuries. After the war, Willy and his first wife, Katie, moved to Greenwich Village in New York City. Willy became a newspaper writer, and Katie opened a very popular coffee shop in the basement of 156 Waverly Place. It was the kind of place that had no sign or exterior markings. It was more like an insider's club. They met everyone who was someone in Greenwich Village. Nobel Prize-winning author Sinclair Lewis, poet and playwright Edna St. Vincent Millay, painter Bob Chandler, puppeteer Tony Sarg, and many others. But one of the more interesting people they met and became friends with was Aleister Crowley.
Aleister Crowley was an occultist, a writer, and a mountaineer. When Willy first met Crowley, Willy thought that he looked like a nursery imp masquerading as Mephistopheles. Crowley was known as the most wicked man in the world, who used to sign his letters with the Beast 666. Throughout his life, Crowley was kicked out of most European countries for running various occultist cults. Crowley once owned a house on the shores of Loch Ness, Boleskine House, where he attempted to perform a lengthy ceremony of Abramelin the Mage. Some believe that he might have conjured the monster from the lake. He was unsuccessful in completing the full ritual. The house was later owned by musician Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. Sadly, it burned down a few years ago. In the summer of 1920, Willy invited Crowley to his farm outside Atlanta. Crowley spent 2 months there, which was plenty of time for them to do some experiments. One night they talked about the vow of silence taken by Trappist monks, and so they decided to do a variant of that, by speaking for a week using one prearranged monosyllable. Some of the monosyllables that were rejected were woof, moo, and ba. The word that they chose was wow, and so they spent an entire week saying nothing but the word wow. Willy and Crowley were amazed at how well they could communicate with different intonations of a single word. Then, one night they drank a gallon of moonshine and had an incredible conversation using the word wow. Willy insisted that he and Crowley held a deep and profound philosophical conversation that lasted for hours. He later wrote about that experience in what he claimed to be his only work of fiction that he sold to a magazine called The Smart Set. The previous summer, Crowley decided to go into the wilderness for 40 days to engage in prayer and meditation. At the time, Crowley didn't have any money, so Willy and Katie gave him cash and a list of provisions that he was going to need, then bought him a canoe and a tent. The next day they went to see Crowley off and discovered that he had spent the money for food on 50 gallons of red paint. They were beside themselves, and they asked him how he was going to eat. Crowley said, "I will be fed as Elijah was fed, by the ravens," and off he went. Somehow, during his 40-day retreat, he convinced the local farmers to feed him while he painted on the cliffs, in gigantic red letters, 2 enormous sentences: "Every man and woman is a star," and "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Willy eventually managed to turn his friendship with Crowley into a lurid 12-part series titled Astounding Secrets of the Devil Worshipper's Mystic Love Cult. It was the tale of Crowley's depraved cult in Sicily, where one of the cultists died supposedly after drinking cat blood in a dark ritual. Crowley's response to the series was mixed. He felt no ill will towards Willy, but he felt that Willy was a backslider on his quest to become a serious writer, and that his story was absurdly incomplete. Finally, Crowley said of Willy, "When the facts failed, they must be filled up with fiction, and where they obstructed his wild career, they must be distorted into fantastic form."
Willy enjoyed writing newspaper articles for Hearst and King Features Syndicate. He said they wanted good, clear, exciting, vivid writing and were willing to pay for it. And yet Willy knew that his literary friends hated William Randolph Hearst. In fact, there was an office joke about a Hearst writer who said that he had told his mother that he played piano in a brothel instead of writing for Hearst to explain the fat paychecks. During these years in New York City and Greenwich Village, Willy and Katie were surrounded by sculptors, architects, artists, and writers. Because Willy had once sold his short story Wow to the literary magazine The Smart Set, he was usually introduced to members of high society as a short story writer. But the stain of being a writer for Hearst did stick to Willy and showed up in surprising ways. Years later, when Willy was introduced to his favorite writer, Theodore Dreiser, a man who had just missed getting the Nobel Prize in Literature, Willy was introduced as the writer of The Magic Island and Jungle Ways. Dreiser sneered at him and made a cruel comment about yellow journalism. This slight deeply hurt Willy and reinforced the stigma that his time with Hearst had left with him. But when Willy was working for the paper, he enjoyed it thoroughly. He embraced sensationalism and wrote many articles, including one about the bob-haired bandit.
The bob-haired bandit was the story of a petite young woman named Cecilia Cooney and her husband who had committed a series of armed robberies in 1924. The tiny Cecilia had worn a series of bob-haired wigs of different colors and materials, which fired the public's imagination. They were eventually caught after 10 robberies and jailed. Willy's boss decided that the paper was going to run 10 to 12 installments of her full confession. Her story was the biggest thing in the news at the time. She seemed to be a modern woman who had turned to crime. Every paper was trying to get access to her. Willy was given a roll of $100 bills and 2 certified checks to get her story. Willy got into the jail and got Cecilia to sign an exclusive contract. He was going to ghostwrite her confession and generate as much sympathy for her as possible. He needed photographs for the story, so he went to Katie's coffee house and got a suitcase full of donated clothes from all the young women who were there. The next morning, he set up a one-woman fashion show in the jail, where Cecilia was photographed in a number of outfits, including one photo that had her in Katie's turban and handcuffs that belonged to Willy's play partner, Deborah Luris. Cecilia was sentenced to 20 years. She was released after 7. She lived a quiet, uneventful life until she died in 1992. After the success of this story, Willy was promoted to being an associate publisher. He hated the position. He spent several years doing the business side of publishing and not writing very much, until he fired himself and went back to his old job as a writer for King Features Syndicate. But the fun was gone. He was itching to do something else.
After several years of writing for Hearst, Willy befriended a young sheikh in Katie's cafe, Daoud Izzedin, who talked non-stop about his family in Arabia. He talked about the pashas riding camels in the desert, the ancient castles in the hills, and about the mystical whirling dervishes. These tales completely intrigued Willy. He and Katie made arrangements to visit Daoud's family, and they ended up spending a year there. Willy was in heaven. He got to ride with the Bedouins into battle. He slept under the desert stars at night. He got to study the altered states and living religion of the whirling dervishes, and got to visit ancient temples in the mountains. But mostly, he was vastly enamored by spending time in societies that were unchanged after 1,000 years. He became friends with a desert pasha, who offered him the position of a minor sheikhship with command of 100 horsemen. But Willy turned him down, and he and Katie went back to the United States. When he and Katie came back to New York, the public was clamoring for stories about Arabia. A few years earlier, tales about Lawrence of Arabia had electrified the public's interest in all things Arabian. Willy was invited to give a talk about his Arabian adventures at the Foreign Policy Association meeting. At the meeting, the publisher of the magazine Asia asked Willy for a 6-part article. These articles led to a book contract. In 1927, Adventures in Arabia was published. It was a well-received book, and Willy was ecstatic that he had written his first real book. His early childhood dream of being a writer was coming true, and his future looked brighter than ever. His second book was about Haiti, called The Magic Island. But next, we're going to talk about his third book, Jungle Ways, and explore Willy's descent into cannibalism.
Shortly after Willy's second book, The Magic Island, was published, he was invited to lunch in New York City by a man named Paul Morand. Paul was a writer and in the French diplomatic service. He was rich, famous, and had a lot of political influence in France. At lunch, Paul said that no matter what Willy was planning to do next, he simply had to go to West Africa. Paul had recently returned and said that the things that Willy had experienced in Haiti were nothing compared to what waited for him in West Africa. There were bigger voodoo temples, more elaborate jungle rituals and ceremonies, and stylized dancing that equaled the ballet russe. And he said all of this culture was dying out because of the colonial occupation and commercial exploitation. Of course, Paul mentioned that he knew about certain warrior tribes that still practiced traditional cannibalism, and other tribes that still practiced ritual human sacrifice. He mentioned that all the African explorers knew about these tribes, but they were all too much in a hurry to fully appreciate the situation. Paul told Willy that he could provide names, places, and access to voodoo priests and witch doctors, and that he could help facilitate the trip. Then he said, "You must see a human sacrifice, and you must eat human flesh. Unless you succeed in doing one or the other, or both if you can, I wouldn't write the book at all." Cannibal warning. So we are about to talk about cannibalism. We'll let you know when we're done. There will not be any graphic images about or vivid descriptions of cannibalism, so it won't be too bad.
So Willy and Katie went to West Africa and spent a year there. He was introduced to the various warrior tribes, including the cannibal ones. He observed many esoteric rituals, like the juggler magicians who juggle children, and masked fortune-telling witch doctors. And he spent months studying with various witch doctors in the jungle. And yet he couldn't seem to get into a cannibal feast. Until one day, the king of the cannibals, Monpo, asked Willy for an aphrodisiac. The legend surrounding Willy at that time was that he was an accomplished witch doctor. The problem was that Monpo was going to get married to another wife in an annual tradition. He already had 39 wives from previous traditions, and he was looking for some assistance. Now Willy was in a bit of a spot, because if his medicine didn't work, then Monpo would think that he'd been double-crossed, that Willy wasn't really a witch doctor. But if Willy was successful, he could ask Monpo for a cannibal feast. So Willy made a potion that he had learned during his time in Haiti. The potion was made of rum, powdered shellfish, the sounds of drums, and a lot of singing. Well, the potion was successful, and so Willy asked to partake in the next cannibal feast, and Monpo agreed. Willy didn't have to wait long. The feast happened after a local skirmish. Willy had seen the young enemy warrior killed in battle, but he wasn't allowed to see the preparation because of ritual reasons. Well, Willy figured out that the whole thing was a ruse when a drunken Monpo offered him the hand as a delicacy. Willy could immediately tell that it was not the hand of a man, that it was the hand of an ape. So Willy realized that he was going to have to try something different. After the trip to Africa, Willy and Katie parted ways. Earlier, right before the trip, Willy had fallen in love with a woman named Marjorie, and Katie had fallen in love with Marjorie's husband. So after the trip, the four of them decided to do a permanent wife and husband swap.
Willy and Marjorie went to France. Willy made arrangements with a friend, Jean-Guyon Cosbrun, which is probably a made-up name, but Willy claimed he was a journalist who covered accidents for the local paper. Years later, Willy described his real experience with cannibalism in his autobiography, No Hiding Place, in one succinct paragraph. Marjorie, however, in her book, The Strange World of Willy Seabrook, devoted a very dramatic chapter to the whole experience. She was deeply disturbed by this experience. The arrangements that Willy had made with his complice were in Paris. He and Marjorie lived in Toulon, so they traveled to Paris and had to borrow the kitchen of a friend, Willy's French translator, Daniel Blanc. Willy told the cook that the meat was a wild African goat that had never been eaten before. So the cook offered to roast a piece, broil the next, and make a ragout with the remaining pieces. About that time, Daniel Blanc's vegetarian wife came home with a friend, and they seemed very intrigued with the exotic meat. Marjorie was horrified, and managed to convince everyone but Willy to not eat any of the dishes. Willy was delighted by the experience. He wrote 5 pages about the experience of eating human flesh, but he made sure that it was published in the chapter of his book about Africa. He said that it tasted like fully developed veal or fine young baby beef.
So 6 months after Willy's book, Jungle Ways, was published, some French journalists came back from West Africa and wrote several articles mocking Willy and laughing about how he had been duped by the cannibal king, and that he'd been served and eaten an ape instead of a human. Well, that's when Daisy Fellows enters this story. Daisy Fellows was an American heiress of the singer sewing machine fortune who lived in Paris and was a friend of Willy's. The quote that best describes her is that she lived on grouse, cocaine, and other women's husbands. She was an extraordinary woman who was regularly voted one of the best-dressed women in the world, and she was once photographed wearing a hat that looked like a shoe. Some of her other claims to fame are that she was the 20th century's greatest collector of fine jewelry, and some say she had a color created for her called shocking pink. Also, her parties were legendary. When asked for advice about how to throw a good party, Daisy said, "Just pour Benzedrine into the cocktails, darling." So one day, she and the actor Douglas Fairbanks Sr. visit Willy. She was quite sympathetic to his being ridiculed in the Parisian press about his cannibalism failure. So she said, "I think you deserve to know what human flesh really tastes like. I'm going to give you a dinner party in my garden next week." Of course, Willy couldn't tell her that he'd already eaten human flesh from the Paris morgue, so he said nothing and looked forward to the event. The dinner party was, as usual for Daisy, marvelous. They had drinks that followed the recipe that Willy had learned from the White Monk of Timbuktu, where Pernod and Amère-Picon, a bitter orange-flavored French aperitif, were mixed in equal parts. They sat in the garden at a table covered with white linen and silver, and were served by an army of uniformed staff. When the dinner was over, Willy said that the grilled meat tasted like fully developed veal or fine young baby beef. It looked and tasted exactly like human flesh. He also said that nobody but Daisy Fellows knows what the real truth is about that cannibal feast. Whether or not it was human flesh and where she got it, no one knows. Willy's book Jungle Ways was a sensation, and he might have become known for his cannibalism if it hadn't been for his second book about his earlier trip to Haiti. Cannibal warning over. We now return to our regular presentation about zombies.